Right, we're talking about High Rise, J.G. Ballard. And I read it annoyingly. I read it about a week ago, so it's not that fresh in my mind now. I know a week ago is not a long time, but I've got two young kids at home, and I've got the brain of a. I was going to say a sponge, but not a sponge. The opposite of the sponge, a sieve. A sieve. I've got the brain of a sieve. There we go. That should probably highlight it for you. So yeah, it's not that fresh in my mind. I can't remember as much as I would like to, and I thought about making notes maybe as I was going along with all the books I read, just so I can say more in these. But I'm trying to be a bit more spontaneous. So the book. It was quite nice and refreshing for me to read because the last book I read was The Day After Judgment, and that had quite a dark, really unfamiliar setting. It was quite alien towards the end, and the book is quite heavy. And it was quite refreshing to change to this book, where certainly the start of it isn't very heavy. It's very familiar. It's about a youngish professional, maybe late 20s, early 30s, recently divorced, who moves into a tower block in London. For me, I've worked in London for the last 10, 15 years. And I've lived in apartment blocks in London, and I still commute into London quite regularly as well. So it was quite nice to change to a sort of more familiar setting that was grounded really in much more in reality. Um, the plot of the book is it's essentially about this high rise that the main character moves into, and the 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 high rise itself represents the hierarchy of society. And what I mean by that is on the early floors, you have kind of lower end professionals, um, maybe air stewards, lower paid professionals, kind of TV camera crew, things like that. As you slowly move up and up through the apartment blocks, there's 50 floors, and as you move up, each floor kind of represents a slightly higher monetary and class status. So you may have, professionals, university lecturers, doctors, kind of in the middle block, and then at the top end you basically have the aristocracy, or uh, high end TV actresses, actors, etc. And the plot of the book is basically how this sort of microcosm of a world um, descends into just complete carnage and anarchy, and it's sort of about the sort of unstated how the unstated social pressures eventually filter in, and they're kind of subtle at first, and people's differences are subtle and unstated, and there's kind of bitching and gossip, and then it eventually descends into this violent um, mayhem of the building in the building. And it kind of talks about how that happens and how that slowly happens, and then what the residents are doing about that. I don't really want to say any more, and that does take a lot of the plot. I wouldn't consider that a spoiler, because yeah, I think it's sort of the premise of the plot. I don't think I've told you anything that you wouldn't have found out on the blurb, for instance. And it's not the story's not really about that. It's more about how this affects people, and how these changes happen. Uh, I loved the first 30-40% of it. I just JG Ballard as a writer is so good, and he's good in the way that you don't even notice he's good. So it's really easy to read, and then you just sort of read a passage and you go, oh, that passage was like amazing, and then you read another one and you're like, oh, like he's actually just topped that. But it's not. It doesn't feel like he's trying too hard. Like I know, Oscar Wilde. I struggle reading because yes, I can tell he's an amazing writer, obviously, but it's really hard to get through, and you have to kind of read and reread, or at least I have to read and reread. and it gets too descriptive and it just loses me. JG Ballard isn't like that. He's clearly such a talented writer, and I'm realizing how spoiled I've been with just how amazing all these writers are. Um, but the the plot itself, I I don't know. I know it's obviously meant to be analogous and meant to represent, wider themes, or at least that seems like the obvious point to make. He's got an underlying message here about the strata of society, and that's good. But I found myself just massively suspending my disbelief for so much of this. Just being like, well, like this would never happen, and it's not really a science fiction book. I would say almost at all. There's no like there's nothing special that happens. There's no technology. There's no magic. There's nothing like that. Um, or if there is, it completely went over my head. Um, and so it just all of these incredibly odd, disconcerting things are happening, but it just wasn't believable for me, and that made me struggle a bit. Fortunately, the book is so well written, like well paced, interesting, that it didn't matter. Like I just kept wanting to read it, and every time I sat down, I was just very happy reading it, um, even with this suspension of disbelief in my head. Um, but yeah, I'd be interested. I'd be interested to see what other people thought. I know it's a classic. I know it's a masterpiece. I know J.G. Ballard is regarded as one of the best English writers of the last century, and I can completely see why. But this one, I definitely want to read more Ballad, but the I don't know how to say it. It's weird. Like it is weird. There are bits in the book that are unnecessarily weird and don't really make sense and don't characterize anything. I don't kind of want to say what they are because I want to try and keep this channel, you know, PC friendly and PG-13 or whatever the term is. I don't really want to talk about more adult topics, but there were just bits in it where I was like, "What? Why is the guy writing about this? It doesn't it doesn't add to the plot." If you're wondering what I'm talking about, ask me in the comments and I'll explain. But yeah, it's I don't know. I think I need to read more Ballad, but from what I can gather, like A Crash is one of his most famous novels, and that I think that is extremely weird. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through that one, to be honest. But I still want to read him. I can completely see why he has the reputation that he does, and I would say read the book. Definitely read the book. Um, especially the beginning. The beginning is so like realistic, and it really reminded me of like certain things that have happened in my life, certain things in London, certain ways that yeah, people try and show their superiority or dislike of someone through politeness or kind of how they do that in polite society, and it was so realistic, it was so well represented, um, but yeah, it lost me a little bit with this lack of realism for no with no justifiable explanation. I don't mind a lack of realism, obviously. Like I really like science fiction and fantasy books, but when it's not what's the word I'm looking for? What is the word? Intrinsically in am I thinking intrinsically? Yeah, when it's not intrinsically consistent, there we go. But it's not when it doesn't make sense in and of itself, I really struggle with that. And this book is one example of that. So again, I'd give this I think a 4 star on Goodreads, although I'm really starting to think that the Goodreads rating system makes like no sense, and I don't even know what I'd do. If I do it, if I'd be scoring it out of 10, I would give this a 7.5. So maybe that's a better way of looking at it. So very good. Would definitely tell people to read it. Completely see why J.G. Ballard is considered a genius. He obviously is.